The orchestra had already tuned twice by the time Mira Voss found herself in the wrong argument, with the wrong man in the wrong corner of the Aldenmere assembly rooms, and she did not yet know that her father had signed her future away before he left for the country 3 weeks prior. Had she known, she would still have said what she said. That much, at least, she would discover about herself before the night was over. It had begun with a chair. A single gilt chair near the east window, the only one positioned away from the crush and close enough to the lamp that she could read the program without performing the squint she had promised herself she would abandon before the season was out. She had reached it first. She was certain of that. Her hand was already on the back when the hand appeared beside hers, larger, bare of gloves, as if the owner could not be troubled, and pressing down with the settled authority of a man who had never once needed to announce himself in a room. She looked up. He was already looking down, in the manner of someone who had been watching her approach with interest and had simply decided not to mention it. "The chair is spoken for," he said. No preamble, no apology, no glance away. By whom? She kept her voice pleasant. This was her first and best strategy in any room, pleasantness as armor, pleasantness as edge. By me. As of now, she removed her hand from the chair and folded both hands at her waist. She would remember that choice longest, afterward, the choice not to concede, only to reposition. "How remarkably efficient," she said. "You must find the world very accommodating." Something moved in his face. Not amusement. The thing that precedes amusement in a person who has forgotten they are capable of it. His name was Calder Ashmore, though she did not know that yet either. What she knew was the cut of his coat, which was excellent and attended to without vanity. The callus at his right thumb. The dark circles carried with such indifference they had nearly become a feature. He was perhaps 10 years her senior, and he looked at her the way her old tutor had looked at a proof he suspected of containing an error he could not yet locate. "Do you want the chair?" he said. "Or do you want to argue about the chair? Can I not have both?" Now the thing in his face completed itself, not a smile. The structure of one, briefly, before it was put away. She sat in the chair. He did not protest. He remained standing beside it, which was itself a kind of persistence she decided to find instructive rather than irritating. Behind them, the room was doing what assembly rooms do, filling with noise and silk and the anxious mathematics of mothers counting titles against daughters. Mira Voss was not being counted. She was 26, notably plain by the season's conventions, notably direct by anyone's, and she had come to the Aldenmere ball because her employer, Mrs. Hatfield, had promised her the evening free if she would first spend the afternoon untangling the household accounts, which Mira had completed in 3 hours to Mrs. Hatfield's vocal astonishment. She had come for the lamp and the program and the possibility of music. She had not come to be married, which was fortunate since no one had come to marry her. Except, it turned out, that was not precisely true. But the letter was in her father's study, and her father was in Worcestershire, and she was here, arguing with a man about a chair. "Are you a friend of the Aldenmeres?" she asked, in the tone she used when she meant to gather information and not appear to be doing so. "Of a kind." He was watching the room with the expression of a man performing a duty he had assigned himself on insufficient grounds. "And you?" "I am a guest of Mrs. Hatfield," the woman in yellow there, speaking very loudly about her nephew. He found Mrs. Hatfield in the crowd without difficulty, which told Mira he had been mapping the room since he arrived. "Her nephew is not here," he observed. "The nephew is never here. He serves his purpose at a distance." She paused. "You have not told me your name." "No." She waited. The orchestra began, a country dance, which filled the floor and gave the corner some relief. "That is a peculiar conversational choice," she said at last. "I find it clarifying. People who want the name for its own sake stop there. People who want to know who I am keep asking." She considered this. "And which do I appear to be?" "I don't know yet," he said. "That's why I'm still standing here." Something in the honest structure of this stayed with her, the way an unusual sentence sometimes does, not what it said, but how little it needed to perform. She opened her program. She could feel him not leaving, which was distinct from the ordinary experience of someone simply being nearby. "Mira Voss," she said to the program. In case you were also curious, she heard the slightest shift of his weight. "I know who you are, Miss Voss." She looked up then. He was still watching the room, but the line of his jaw had changed in the small way that a jaw changes when a man has said a thing he meant to hold back and has not yet decided if he regrets it. "Well," she said carefully, "that does make us unequal." He said nothing. The dance went on. A young woman was steered past them by an anxious mother, and the young woman sent Mira a sympathetic glance of the variety exchanged between persons who have both been failed by the evening and know it. Mira returned it with the precise warmth she reserved for strangers she was predisposed to like. "You do that very quickly," the man beside her said. "Do what? Read a room. And then decide." She looked at him directly. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he paused, and something in the pause cost him. "It is the opposite." That was where the first part of the evening ended, not in any resolution, but in a door opening somewhere in the house, a draft moving through the assembly rooms, and the lamp beside her chair guttering and catching again. In the brief dimness before it steadied, she saw his face without its composure, just for a moment, and the expression she found there was one she had seen before, in the mirror, in the early weeks after her mother died. The look of a person who has arranged their life around the expectation of being alone in it, and who is not sure what to do now that the arrangement is becoming uncomfortable. She filed the observation and asked him nothing about it. Not then. The supper interval brought Mrs. Hadfield in a state of productive agitation. She arrived with 2 plates she had obtained through methods Mira preferred not to examine too closely, pressed one into Mira's hands, surveyed Calder Ashmore with undisguised assessment, and announced, "You are Ashmore." "Of Delvane. I am," he said. Mrs. Hadfield looked at Mira. "Your father," she said, "has been corresponding with this man's solicitor for 6 weeks." She said it with the firm air of one imparting a weather report that requires action. The chicken cutlet on Mira's plate became suddenly very interesting. "Has he?" she said. "I assumed you knew. I have learned," Mira said evenly, "never to assume my father has told me a thing simply because he has done it." She did not look at Ashmore. She could feel him not looking at her, which was a different geometry entirely, deliberate, careful, not the indifference of a man caught out, but the stillness of one who has decided that whatever she needed to feel in this moment, he would not make it worse by watching. That was, she thought, the action of someone who had been trained at some point in the management of difficult news. She filed that too. When Mrs. Hadfield was drawn away by the siren call of a baronet's mother, Mira set down her plate. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was proud of this in the way she was proud of most things she had trained into herself through repetition and necessity, not warmly, but with a clean, practical satisfaction. "You knew," she said, not an accusation. A statement requiring no particular response. "Yes, and you did not say so." "I thought," he said carefully, "that you deserved to enjoy the argument about the chair." She turned to look at him. He met her gaze without flinching, which was the correct response, and also he was, she noticed this against her wishes, entirely sincere. this was not a man managing her. This was a man who had come to a ball that clearly caused him discomfort to look at a woman his solicitor had described on paper and had remained standing in a corner with her for 40 minutes without introduction because, apparently, he thought she deserved an evening's ignorance before the weight of it arrived. This was either the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for her in several years or a catastrophic intrusion, and she was not yet certain which. "What did my father ask for?" she said. Something in Ashmore's face went very still, enough to settle his debts, clear the house, leave you with a portion of your own. The orchestra resumed. The sound covered whatever small adjustment she was required to make in her breathing. "And what," she said, "did you ask for?" He was quiet for a moment that contained a great deal. "Someone," he said at last, "who would look at my accounts and tell me what was actually in them. My steward died last winter. His predecessor, I am recently informed, may have been." He stopped. "I have a situation that requires a precise mind and considerable discretion. You want a wife who will do your books. I want," he said very quietly, "a wife. The books are an honest way of saying so." The honesty of it sat between them like an object placed on a table for examination. She examined it. It was not romantic in any ordinary sense. It was the most useful thing she had been offered in 26 years. "I haven't agreed to anything," she said. "No," he said. "You haven't." The fact that he did not press it, that he simply acknowledged it as the statement of fact it was, without attempting to argue or to soften, was the thing she took home with her that night and turned over in the dark, unable to sleep, while somewhere in Worcestershire her father slept soundly in the knowledge of a transaction he had not thought to disclose. She took up her position at Delvane 3 weeks later. Not as a fiancée. That, she had made clear, was a term she was not yet prepared to inhabit. As a guest of professional purpose, Mrs. Hatfield having furnished an impeccable and entirely fictitious basis in the form of a distant cousinship that satisfied the neighborhood's requirements for explanation. Her actual purpose was the accounts. She would always remember the library on the first morning. Light coming in long and low from the east, the smell of beeswax and old paper, and the desk, a great mahogany affair covered in ledgers, stacked with the desperation of a man who understood they contained bad news, but could not translate them into the form the bad news was in. She had stood at the threshold and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific pleasure of a problem in proportion to her abilities. Delvane itself was quietly beautiful in the way things are beautiful when they have been tended honestly for a very long time. Stone worn smooth, gardens a little overgrown, but in the manner of gardens that remember their own plan. Servants who had been there long enough to know where every creak in every stair lived, and to make no comment upon it. The housekeeper was a woman of 60 named Pell, built along the lines of a well-maintained fortress, who had served Ashmore's mother and regarded the current lord with the affectionate bluntness of someone who has watched a person grow up and knows exactly what they are worth. Pell brought her tea without being asked on the first morning and set it at the corner of the desk and said, "He hasn't slept properly in 4 months, in case it becomes relevant." "I'm here for the ledgers, Mrs. Pell. Of course you are." Pell looked at the ledgers with the expression of a woman confronting a long-standing enemy. So was the last man. Officially, you'll find he wasn't. Then she left, and Mira opened the first ledger and began. The nature of accounts is that they do not lie. People lie in them, certainly. They omit and transpose and introduce small fictions, with the patient confidence of someone who believes no one will look closely enough, but the accounts themselves are blameless. They only record. All Mira had to do was listen to what they were recording. What they were recording within the first afternoon was interesting. Calder Ashmore came to find her at 5 o'clock, as if he had been waiting all day for a reasonable excuse. He stopped in the doorway. She had by this point removed her outer gloves, and her hair was somewhat amended from the morning, and she did not look up from the page she was working through. "You've been at it for 7 hours," he said. "Have I?" She made a note in the margin. Turned the page. He came to stand beside the desk, at a respectful distance, the distance of a man who had decided to be respectful and was executing it carefully. He looked at the page. He looked at her notations. "You write very small," he said. "I write very precisely. There's a difference." She set down the pen and looked up at him. He looked tired in the way he had looked tired at the ball, but there was also something different in his face here, some slight loosening, as if this house gave him, at minimum, the relief of not performing. "Your steward, the one who died." His name was? Rowe, Edmund Rowe. 20 years in the position. His son came after him. The son's name. Felix, something shifted in his jaw. He is currently in Bath. Bath, she repeated. Convenient. Ashmore looked at the ledger. Then at her. "You've found something. I've found the shape of something. The shape is consistent with certain conclusions. I am not prepared to draw them yet." She folded her hands on the desk. "I will need access to the household correspondence from the last 2 years. Whatever Rowe the younger sent to the solicitor. Any receipts stored separately from the ledgers. I'll have Pell show you the correspondence cabinet tonight." "Thank you." She paused. "One more thing. Is the elder Rowe's personal record of accounts, the working copy he would have kept himself, among his effects?" Ashmore was very still. "There was a fire," he said, "in Rowe's cottage at the time of his death. The estate records survived because they were here. His personal working copy did not." No, she held his gaze. He held hers. What passed between them in that moment was not comfort and not accusation, only the quiet mutual acknowledgement that the fire was interesting and that they both found it so. "I'll need until the end of the week," she said. He nodded and left without asking for more, which was, she thought, the correct response. She returned to the ledger. Outside the window, the Delvane gardens were going gold in the evening light, and a blackbird was doing something emphatic in the old yew, and she sat for just a moment with her hands flat on the cool pages and breathed. The week was when she met Felix Rowe. He arrived on the 4th day, unannounced, in a new coat of unusual expense for a man in his position, and he came directly to the library. He had the kind of fair, symmetrical face that makes people feel predisposed to trust it, and the kind of soft, even voice that carries no detectable edge, and he stood in the doorway of the library and looked at her seated at his father's desk with an expression of welcome that did not quite reach the level of the eyes. "Miss Voss," he said, "I had not expected to find you still at work. I hope Delvane has been comfortable." "Very," she said. She did not stand. She had learned early that remaining seated while men came to doors was one of the simplest methods of establishing the terms of an encounter. "We were not expecting you, Mr. Rowe. Lord Ashmore is an old friend. I trust I am not intruding." He was already looking at the desk, at the ledgers, at her notations, which she had turned face down without appearing to do so, in the unhurried way she had of doing things without appearing to do them. "Not at all," she said. "I believe his lordship is in the East Field. Pell will know." He went. She waited until she heard his footsteps down the corridor, and then she sat quite still and thought. She thought about a man who returns from Bath on the 4th day of a new account keeper's work. She thought about the fire in a cottage. She thought about a working copy of accounts that did not survive the fire. She thought about 4 months of a lord who has not slept. She thought about what it costs a man to hold a secret when the secret is not his original wrong but his attempt to contain one, when the thing he conceals is not guilt but the effort of protecting someone at his own expense. She went to the correspondence cabinet that evening after supper, alone with a candle, and she was there for 3 hours. What she found, she did not tell him that night. The knowledge she now held was a thing she needed to understand completely before she laid it before anyone, because knowledge deployed without full understanding is the most effective weapon a person with partial information can use against you, and she was increasingly certain that partial information was the game being played, and had been played for 2 years at least. She found him the next morning in the stables, which she had not expected. He was not inspecting the horses, he was mending tack, with the quiet concentration of a man doing work his hands knew, without his attention, and his coat was off, and his sleeves were turned back, and his hands moved with a competence she found she had no adequate response to. He looked up when she appeared in the stable door. "You look like you've been awake since 3, he said. 4, she said. She leaned against the doorframe. The blackbird was somewhere nearby, still at its emphatic business. "I have a question." "One?" "For now. How much money does Felix Rowe believe he will inherit from this estate if you die without issue?" The hands went still on the leather. He looked at her with the expression she had by now classified as his most guarded, not the blankness he turned to the room, but something quieter and more interior, the look of a man examining the distance between where he stands and where honesty requires him to step. "More than is accurate," he said at last. "Because your father's will was amended." A very long pause. The horse in the nearest stall shifted its weight. "Yes," he said. "And you have not told him." "I thought." He stopped. Began again. He set down the tack and turned to face her fully. "I thought if I could solve it quietly, without, I have been trying to protect. You have been trying to protect the memory of a man who used it against you," she said. It was not harsh. It was precise. You believed Edmund Rowe was loyal. He was, for 15 years. And then he wasn't, and rather than discover what he had done, you locked the doors and engaged a solicitor and found yourself a wife who could manage accounts, and you hoped the shape of it would resolve. She paused. "I am telling you, it will not resolve. Felix Rowe has your working accounts and has been amending the duplicate that should have remained here. He has been doing so for 19 months. He came back 4 days early because Pell wrote to tell him you had brought someone in." Ashmore stood very still. The morning light came through the stable door behind her and put him in a particular clarity she could not look away from. The stillness of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it, and the faintest motion in the jaw that was, she understood now, the only form his anger ever took. "Show me," he said. She did. They spent 4 hours in the library with the correspondence and the ledgers laid side by side, the light moving across the desk as the morning turned. And she walked him through it without softening and without drama, point by point, the way she would have explained a household account to Mrs. Hadfield, or a crop rotation to a tenant, plainly in sequence, with the evidence in hand. He asked 3 questions. She answered them. He made no sound that was not strictly necessary, and when she was done, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table and looked at nothing in particular. "There is one thing I cannot yet establish from the documents alone," she said. "The letter of amendment to your father's will. Felix Rowe has it, or a copy of it, and he has been making certain you cannot find the original long enough to verify what it actually says. Where would the original be?" She looked at him. I believe your father may have written you a second letter. Not through the solicitor. Privately, she paused. Is there anything of your father's that you keep? The hands on the table. The breath. The smallest alteration in his face that she had learned, by now, to read as the place where the armor showed its seam. His watch, he said. And a case of letters he kept locked. I have not opened the case. A pause. I have not been able to open it. She said nothing. The blackbird came back to the U outside the window. The watch was in his breast pocket. She had noticed it weeks ago. Noticed the way his hand sometimes moved there without his awareness. The way a person's hand goes to the thing they carry. The case, she said quietly. I think you should open it. He looked at her then, fully, without the management he usually applied to the act of looking at her. And she saw that the difficulty was not grief, or not only grief. The difficulty was that the case was the last thing that was still closed, and, once opened, his father's death would be complete in some way it had not yet been. I'll be here, she said. That was all. It was, she discovered, the right amount. He left. She waited. She looked at the ledgers and the correspondence and the shape of a young man's long, patient crime, arranged before her like a proof she had been working through for years without knowing what the proposition was. He came back in an hour. He set a letter on the desk. It was addressed in his father's hand, and it had been written in the last month of the old lord's life. He sat down, and he did not look at it. Read it, he said. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she set it carefully in the center of the desk and put her hand on it, flat, the way you put your hand on a thing you are making a promise about. Your father knew, she said. He knew what Edmund Rao had done. He did not know about Felix. He wrote to tell you the true terms of the will and where the original is kept, in the hands of a man called Marsden in the village, a retired magistrate to whom he had given it in trust. He wrote it down because he thought you would need the proof stated plainly by him in his own hand when the time came. Calder Ashmore sat for a very long time. The light finished crossing the desk. The blackbird fell silent. He knew, he said finally, and the two words carried the freight of 4 months' sleeplessness and the specific pain of discovering that the person you lost had tried to protect you even at the end. He knew, she said. And he left you what you needed. There was a silence between them that was not empty. She had been careful, for 6 weeks now, to keep precise track of what she felt about this man and where she put it, in the category of professionally interesting and personally inadvisable, and the reason she had come down to the stables, and the reason she had told him what it cost him to hear, and the reason she was, right now, watching the side of his face with an attention she had run out of honest ways to classify as professional. He said, I asked you here under false pretenses. You asked me here because you needed someone to trust with a problem you couldn't solve alone. That is, he said, carefully, true, and also false pretenses. She looked at the window. The U was absolutely still now. You should write to Marsden today, she said, and to your solicitor, not the one Felix Rowe has been consulting, a different one. Yes, and Felix Rowe should not be told that you have found any of this. No, she stood and began straightening the papers. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She was, as she understood it, still angry, not at him, but at the shape of the thing. The 2 years of a good man's confidence being spent by someone patient enough to do it a half shilling at a time. The anger was clean, and she knew exactly what to do with it. I will need 2 more days, she said, to complete the account of the full amount taken. You will want numbers when you go before Marsden. Miss Voss. His voice had changed. Something in it was lower and less careful. I need to tell you something. Later, she said. She gathered her notes and looked at him, and the thing she read in his face was the thing she had seen in the stable doorway, the seam in the armor, and through the seam something that had been waiting a long time for a reason to declare itself. Tell me after it's done. Tell me when it can mean what you intend it to mean, and not what the situation requires. He held her gaze. After a moment, the very smallest thing, not quite a smile, and not quite acquiescence, and not quite respect, but something that lived in the territory shared by all three. Yes, he said. She took her papers and went back to work. It was Pell who broke it, as Mira had suspected it would be. Pell had been watching Felix Rowe since his arrival, with the eyes of a housekeeper who has served one family long enough to know where every lace and ledger belongs, and to notice when they don't. And it was Pell who, on the evening of the 5th day, appeared in the doorway of the library where Mira was completing her final account of the full sum taken, and said in a voice of magnificent calm, "He's in the west passage with a candle and a letter he didn't come downstairs with." Which letter? Pell put a small key on the desk, the one from the correspondence cabinet. "Third drawer, the one you took a copy of last Tuesday." Mira looked at the key. "At Pell, you made a copy of the cabinet key." "I've been making copies of things for 40 years, Pell said. "It seemed likely to be useful eventually." She paused. "He knows something has changed. He's been watching you since dinner. You might want to know that." After Pell left, Mira sat for a moment. She was very calm, which was the form her urgency had always taken, a smoothing of everything outside so that the inside could move fast. She thought about Felix Rowe in the West Passage with a candle and a letter he had come downstairs to retrieve, and had now found missing. She thought about a man who has been patient for 19 months and suddenly feels the ground shift. Patient men, discovered, do not stay patient. She went to find Ashmore. He was in the east parlor with a glass of brandy he had not touched, and when she came in, he stood immediately in the reflex of a man trained to manage his own reactions and failing to manage this one. She shut the door. "He's moving the correspondence," she said. "Tonight, he knows we've been through the cabinet. How much time? Enough. Listen." She came to stand near the desk, close enough to speak low. "Marsden is 3 miles. You can be there and back before midnight if you leave now. Bring him the letter, your father's letter, and the account I've completed. Ask him to come tomorrow morning. Not as a friend, in his official capacity with whatever witnesses a retired magistrate can summon at short notice. And Felix, I will manage Felix Rowe." Ashmore looked at her for a moment with the expression she had not yet found a word for, the one that seemed to see her whole and find the whole entirely more than the sum. "You'll be careful. I am always careful." She met his eyes. "Go," he went. She listened to the horse leave the yard, and then she went back to the library and sat down with a lamp and a book, very visibly, and waited. Felix Rowe came to her at 11 o'clock. He was composed in the way he was always composed, the face pleasant, the voice even, and he came in without knocking and stood before the desk, with his hands easy at his sides, and his eyes moving across the surface of the desk with the speed of a man cataloging what was and was not present. "You're working late," he said. "I find the evenings quiet." She did not look up from the book. "Were you looking for something, Mr. Rowe?" "I thought I left a letter in the cabinet." "Did you?" She turned a page. He was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, the voice was exactly the same, gentle, measured, the voice of a man explaining something unfortunate to someone he liked. "Miss Voss, I think there may be some documents in this house that have been misread. Some of my father's paperwork was not well organized at the end." If you found something that looked irregular, I would hate for you to draw conclusions that, Miss Rowe, she said, and she set down the book and looked at him directly, and she made her voice as quiet as his. I have been keeping accounts since I was 15 years old. I know the difference between disorganized and falsified. She paused. I know the difference because disorganized accounts have the look of weather, random, consistent in their inconsistency. Falsified accounts have the look of intention. The errors all lean the same direction. His hands, at his sides, did not move. But his face, the small motion in the jaw that was not precisely the same as Ashmore's, but was in the same family, told her something it did not mean to. She filed it. I don't know what you think you found, he began. I know what I've found. I've found 19 months of estate income redirected through a secondary account opened in your father's name 12 days before his death and continued after it without the knowledge of the estate's legal trustee. She watched him. I've also found the series of letters you sent to the solicitor asserting a verbal agreement about the terms of the will that the solicitor, being cautious, never committed to on paper. She folded her hands. What I don't have, and what you came downstairs to retrieve, is the letter you sent to the solicitor 3 months ago, suggesting that Lord Ashmore had agreed to a revised inheritance arrangement. She paused. Because he hadn't, had he? Felix Rowe looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant face was still pleasant. The even voice, when he used it, was still even. But beneath it, very faint, the way a crack appears in good plaster, the thing that had been underneath the whole time. I've known Calder Ashmore, he said, since we were boys. My father spent 40 years making this estate what it is. He did, she said. And for 38 of them, by your own account's evidence, he served it faithfully. Something shifted in Felix Rowe's expression then. The fine, symmetric face, the face she had, from the first day, found instructively comfortable, the face that wore trust the way expensive fabric wears well without appearing to cost anything, showed, just for a moment, the thing underneath. Not cunning. Older than cunning. Something like a child's arithmetic. I was second, and second was all I was ever going to be, and the arithmetic of that had run in him for years like a low fever, until it became the only calculation he could see. She was not required to feel sorry for him. She felt it anyway, briefly, the way she felt the cold when she went out in it, fully, without complaining about it. You should sleep, she said. Tomorrow will be an early morning. He left. She remained seated until she heard his footsteps on the stair, and then she took her carefully ordered account of the full sum and her copies of the correspondence, and she locked them in her own traveling case, and she went to bed, and she slept, which was the thing she had trained herself to do after difficult encounters, close the account for the night, rest, reopen it in the morning. Ashmore was back before dawn. She heard the horse in the yard. She heard him come in. She heard him stand for a moment in the corridor outside the library before his footsteps went on to the east parlor, and she lay in the dark and thought. Marsden said yes, and he did not come to tell me because he knew I needed sleep. And that was the correct decision. And I am going to have to do something about the fact that I know the shape of his decisions now as well as I know my own. In the morning, she came down to find him already at the library desk, with a cup of tea cooling beside him, and the papers she had left for him spread before him, reading. He looked up when she came in. He had slept, a little, by the look of it, but the circles were different this morning, she thought. Lighter, as if something had been set down. Marsden is coming at 10, he said. Good. He's bringing his cousin, a retired judge, as it happens. Better, he looked at her steadily. Is there anything you need to tell me? Before it begins? No, you have everything I've found. Everything is in order. She paused. "There is one thing I want to ask. Ask it. The mercy." After, she held his gaze. "I know what you think of what he's done. I know what 4 months of this has cost you. I want to ask you, not to be merciful for his sake. He doesn't deserve that. For the sake of the others who would be touched by a public prosecution, the servants who knew his father, the village that doesn't need a scandal to carry for a decade." She paused. "And for your own sake. It's very heavy, a grudge. I've found that to be reliably true." He was very quiet for a moment. "Then, you have found it to be true personally?" "My father," she said, "has sold me twice. Once to a man who wanted an unpaid secretary for his estate, and before that to a school in Yorkshire that wanted a bookkeeper's daughter to teach the other girls arithmetic. He has done it without consultation and without apology, and with complete confidence that it was good business." She looked at the window. "I stopped being angry about it when I understood that he is constitutionally incapable of imagining that I am a person who experiences consequences. It is not cruelty, it is a kind of blindness." She looked back at Ashmore. "I don't recommend holding a grudge against the blind. They cannot see what they've done." He was watching her with the full, uncurated attention again. "An unpaid secretary," he said. "Was that a characterization of your arrangement here? Provisionally, I see. A pause, and the sale you are apparently currently subject to. I told you, I haven't agreed to anything." "No," he said. "You haven't." He looked back at the papers. "The mercy." "You have my word." Marsden arrived with his cousin Judge Whitmore at 10:05, and Pell had arranged them in the east parlor, with tea, and the clear authority of a woman who has been managing large rooms for 40 years and was not about to find this one difficult. Felix Rowe came down at 10:30 to find the room already constituted, the magistrate, the judge, Pell as household witness, and Mira Voss with a leather case of papers on her lap, and Calder Ashmore standing at the window with his hands behind his back in the way he stood when he was very calm, and the calmness was a managed thing. Felix Rowe stopped in the doorway. The composition of the room communicated everything in the time it takes a face to read 4 people's expressions. His own face did what it had always done, arranged itself into pleasantness, a last resort of a habit so deep it operated independently of his intentions. "Good morning," he said. "Come in, Felix," Ashmore said. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. What followed was not a trial. Trials have procedure and ceremony and time. This was something more intimate and more inevitable, a reckoning in a room among people who had all known one another long enough that pretense had nowhere to stand. Mira laid the account before Marsden and walked him through it in the same plain sequence she had walked Ashmore. The numbers, the dates, the directional lean of the errors, the secondary account. She laid the correspondence beside it. She produced the letter Felix Rowe had come downstairs to retrieve, which Pell had obtained and which she had been holding in her case. Felix Rowe's face through this sequence remained, admirably, almost perfectly composed. Almost. It was Judge Whitmore who asked the question that broke it. He had been silent through the entire account, an elderly man with the patient face of someone who has heard many versions of many things and is no longer surprised by any of them. He waited until Mira had finished, and then he looked at Felix Rowe, and he said, "Your father, did he know what you were doing?" And Felix Rowe's face, the symmetrical, pleasant, immaculate face, simply gave way. Not into guilt and not into defiance, into something much older and much sadder than either. The grief line at the corner of his mouth that Mira had noted on the first day and filed and not known how to read. She read it now, the face of a second son who had watched his father give everything to a family that was not his, and who had wanted, at the bottom of all of it, only to be the thing his father had loved best. "No," he said. Just the one word, and then, very quietly, he would have been no. The silence in the room lasted a moment. Then Marsden opened the correspondence Ashmore had brought him from Marsden's own files, the original letter of the late Lord's will, in the old Lord's hand, with the true terms written plainly and the false amendment nowhere in its pages. And he read it aloud, which is the proper way to read a document when there are witnesses, so that it enters the room as a fact, not a claim. When he was done, he looked at Felix Rowe and said, "I think you had better sit down." What Ashmore offered Felix Rowe, once Marsden and Whitmore had retired with Pell to take down the formal record in another room and left them alone with it, was this: the full amount taken, repaid over 7 years from whatever income Felix Rowe could earn, which was not nothing because the man was competent when he was not being criminal. No prosecution. No public scandal. An agreement drawn by a neutral party that would keep the matter from the neighborhood, a letter of character sufficient for a position in another county's estate management, where a man might begin again without the weight of being second. It was more than he deserved. Mira had said so. She had said it before the others arrived, in the library, to Ashmore directly, and she had also said, "Do it anyway." Felix Rowe sat with the terms before him for some time. When he looked up, his face was entirely different from the face it had been. Reduced, somehow, to something smaller and more actual, more forgivable. "Why?" he said. "Because," Ashmore said, "your father served mine faithfully for a very long time, and because the dead cannot be protected by punishing the living." He paused. "And because it is better, on balance, to be the kind of man who does this." It was, Mira thought from her chair in the corner, where she had retreated so that the conversation could be what it needed to be, the most correct and least showy way she had ever heard a complicated moral decision stated aloud. She did not say so. She filed it. Felix Rowe left before noon. Pell saw him out with a civility that was itself a kind of mercy, being exactly equal to the civility she would have extended to any departing guest, no more, no less, and absolutely unremarkable. Marsden and Whitmore had their tea extended and seemed entirely willing to let the estate restore itself around them. They departed at 1 o'clock, with the good cheer of men who have performed a public function well and know it. And then, the house was quiet in the way houses are quiet after a thing that has been a long time coming has finally arrived and settled. The particular quiet of problems resolved rather than postponed. Mira was in the library. She was returning the letters to the correspondence cabinet in the order she had found them, because disorder was a thing she could not leave in her wake even when she was also in the middle of deciding what her life was going to be. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She kept her back to the door. "The sum is accurate," she said. Marsden confirmed it against the originals. "You'll want to engage a new solicitor to structure the repayment schedule. I can give you the name of one in, Miss Voss." She turned. He was in the doorway. He had his coat off, the sleeves still turned back from the morning, and his hands were, for once, simply hanging at his sides, doing nothing, not managing anything. He looked at her with the full, uncurated attention that she had stopped pretending to herself she did not live for. "Earlier," he said, "you told me to wait until it could mean what I intended." She set the last letter in the cabinet and closed the drawer and turned to face him properly. Her heart was doing something emphatic, in the manner of the blackbird in the yew. She observed this with a composure she estimated to be approximately 60% genuine. "I did," she said. "The stakes are dead," he said. "You are not in my employment. You have never been in my employment. You are a guest, presently, and you have solved a problem that I He stopped. Tried again. The voice, when it came, was very quiet and entirely his own. I have been alone in this house for 4 years. I had understood that to be permanent. I had made peace with it. And then a woman argued with me about a chair, and I knew that night that I had been wrong about permanent. She looked at him steadily. You knew that at the ball? I knew that at the ball. You might have said something. You might not have come, he said, if I had. This was, she realized, entirely accurate. She would have been suspicious, and she would have been reasonable, and she would have declined, and she would have been wrong. She stood with this knowledge for a moment, which was the honest thing to do. Marry me, he said, because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take. She looked at his hands, at the callus at the right thumb, at the working hands his rank should not have. She thought about the stable door and the tack and the letter he had not been able to open for 4 months, and the way he had said I'll be here before he went to find it. She thought about the chair and the lamp and the decision he had made to let her have an evening's ignorance before the wait arrived, because he thought she deserved it. You are remarkably inconvenient, she said. I am aware. I came to Delvane for the accounts. I know. And I have also, she said, carefully, run out of honest ways to call it professional. The thing in his face, the structure of a smile that had been there since the ball, produced and put away again and again, completed itself, entirely, and the first real smile she had seen from him was, she noted with a feeling she was not going to classify yet, directed entirely at her, and it changed the whole architecture of his face. Is that a yes? He said. That, she said, is an acknowledgement that I have been outmaneuvered by a chair. She paused. Yes, he crossed the room. He stopped before her. He took her hand, the right one, the one that had been on the chair before his had, and he held it with the steadiness of a man who has decided something and is not going to decide it again. You told me once, he said, that you always have both, the thing and the argument about it. I said that? The first night. The chair. She looked at their hands. She looked at his face. I suppose, she said, that applies here too. Good, he said. I've been looking forward to the argument. They were married in the Delvane chapel on a morning in October, when the trees had gone the color of old copper and the light came in long and gold through the east window and the blackbird, which had, Pell later remarked, no business being there in October, but was clearly not attending to Pell's sense of propriety, sang the whole way through. Pell wept. She did so with the efficiency she applied to everything, using a handkerchief she had clearly prepared in advance, and she was done before the vows were completed and back to her expression of productive authority by the time they came out into the chapel yard. She said only, about time, to no one in particular, and returned to the house to manage the breakfast. Marsden and his cousin attended as witnesses. Mrs. Hadfield came from London in a hired chaise she declared had taken 12 years off her, wore yellow as a point of honor, and spent the breakfast telling anyone who would listen that she had arranged the entire thing, which was not true, but which Mira found she was perfectly willing to permit. Mira's father wrote a letter that arrived the following week, congratulating them both in terms that demonstrated he had always intended this outcome and had managed it with extraordinary skill. Mira read it twice, felt the shape of the old anger, and set it down. He was constitutionally incapable. The blindness was real. She replied warmly and invited him for Christmas. Felix Rowe wrote at Christmas from Devon, where he had taken a position with a small estate whose owner knew nothing of the Aldenmere affair and needed someone with working knowledge of agricultural accounts. His handwriting was neat, and his tone was careful, and at the end of the letter he had added, in a smaller hand as if written after the rest, "My father would not have liked what I became. I think he might not have entirely disliked what I am trying to be now." Mira read that sentence 3 times and gave it to Calder without comment. He read it and set it on the desk and did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Write back something kind." And she did. The henchman, the solicitor's clerk who had been Felix Rowe's instrument in the filing of the false amendment, recanted in writing once it became clear that Marsden held the original and the false amendment could not stand. He lost his position and his reference and moved to Bristol, where he opened a small stationer's shop and prospered modestly and sent Mira, the following spring, a handwritten apology so precisely formatted it had the look of a man's first professional document, which she suspected was very nearly true. Judge Whitmore was made a full circuit judge the following autumn. He sent them a bottle of good wine and a note that said only, "Moral clarity is the finest qualification for the bench." Mrs. Hadfield's nephew appeared briefly at Easter, was immediately eclipsed by Mrs. Hadfield, and departed with the look of a man who has understood that his best function was always performed at a distance. He was, as ever, not precisely there. Pell celebrated her 41st year at Delvane by being given, at her own request, a small increase in the household account for the garden, which she had always considered underfunded, and a new assistant who was afraid of her and improving rapidly as a result. It was the following June, nearly a year on, when Mira came around the corner of the East Passage early in the morning and nearly walked into the man coming the other way from the stables, coat off, a piece of mended tack in hand, and neither of them had expected the other, and they both stopped in the narrow passage in the particular configuration of 2 people who have run out of room. "You're up early," he said. "You always say that. You're always up early." She leaned against the wall. The passage was warm with morning. The blackbird was somewhere outside, exactly where it always was at this hour, at this season, in what she had concluded was simply its home. She looked at her husband. The word still had the particular quality of a thing she had not expected to have, not impossible, simply previously unimaginable, and she looked at the tack in his hand and the state of his sleeves and the callus at his right thumb, and she felt the specific settled happiness of a person whose accounts are honestly kept. "I was thinking," she said, "about the chair." He looked at her. The smile, not the managed structure, but the actual one, the one she had watched complete itself in the library, came immediately, fully, without effort or concealment. "Were you?" "I was thinking," she said, "that I don't know who won." "You do," he said. "Both of us," she said. At the same time, she paused. "That's not how arguments usually work." "No," he said. He moved the tack to his other hand and held out the free one. She took it, the right one, the one she always took, the callous familiar as a found object. "It isn't." The blackbird came around the corner of the East Passage in their direction, and then thought better of it, and returned to the U, and the morning light came through the window at the passage's end, and put them both in the specific gold of a June morning that has already decided to be generous, and there was nothing left to argue about. Which was, as it turned out, the best possible reason to stay. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one nobody crossed the room for, and then one day, unexpectedly, someone did, then you know what Mira carried home from that assembly room, tucked between the program and the lamplight and the argument about a chair. Stories like this one live here at the hearth, and the kettle is always on, and there is always a chair kept by the fire with your name on it. I would love to know, what moment was the one, for you? The chair, the stable door, the morning in the passage, or the letter from a man trying to become better? Come tell me in the comments, and if you'd like to keep a place here by the fire, We would be glad to have you stay. Sleep well and be generous with the ones who let you argue and stayed anyway.